podcast. He's PennLive Steelers beat reporter Nick Farabaugh. I'm John Luciew. And just like that, Steelers Nation, as it's bracing for a snowstorm, is surprisingly jettisoned into the Mike McCarthy era. He is your next head coach, 62 years of age, Super Bowl winner, play caller, offensive guru, quarterback developer, and as the disappointment settles from the fact that the two hotshot upstart young coaching candidates out in LA who will be coaching in the NFC Championship game for the Rams didn't even get an in-person interview in Pittsburgh. So that has fans disappointed. It's being called an uninspiring choice for McCarthy, but there is a clear message being sent. They want McCarthy to develop the Steelers' next franchise quarterback. This franchise hasn't done that since Ben Roethlisberger. And I'm not just talking about since he retired. There were quarterbacks brought in lesser rounds of the draft and a free agency throughout the Roethlisberger era, and none of those were really successfully developed. So that is definitely a glaring need for this franchise. My question is, which quarterback, how this process will look going forward under McCarthy? And the other message, the secondary message, is that the Steelers under Art Rooney II are not going to tank to get that next quarterback. Those are the two signals that I'm reading. I want to go to Nick right now to get all the latest. Obviously, he's been working the phones and his sources. So what are you sensing is this kind of abbreviated coaching process? Because we were talking about a no stone unturned coaching process, and here they kind of cut it short and didn't even do in-person interviews with two of the supposed top candidates. So definitely abbreviated coaching process. A lot of people are saying they even kind of just did the Rooney rule by the numbers instead of by the spirit. They got the two in-person interviews out of the way, but clearly had their sights on McCarthy, who is a Pittsburgh product. So there's accusations that there's a little bit of Yinzer nepotism going on. If you grew up eating chipped ham, you have an in on the Steelers. And of course, there's a heavy relationship, or at least an early relationship, with Omar Khan. So there's that connection with McCarthy. But Nick, you kind of tell us what you're getting and how you read this hiring.
I mean, I think that's probably the lens to look through it, is they wanted somebody that wants to develop a quarterback, or at least has experience doing that. Now, I think McCarthy's a little bit of a tenuous hire in that vein, because we're talking about a guy that has genuinely his entire coaching career played with elite quarterback play. Favre, Rodgers, right into Dak Prescott. He's never had a quarterback situation like this as a head coach. Now, he has had this as an OC and a quarterback's coach. He's coached with guys like Steve Bono, Aaron Brooks, late career Joe Montana. I'm thinking, and then there are like short stints during his Packers period where he had like Matt Flynn, Brett Hundley, Deshaun Kaiser. Thinking, with Dallas, it was mostly Cooper Rush. But like there is some sample size for a lack of quarterback. He had Alex Smith as well, first-year Alex Smith in San Francisco. So he's had some suboptimal quarterback play in other places. That had to be the rationale. It has to be the rationale. It's the only thing that makes sense if you're talking yourself into this being the hire. I do think the other part is, I think Art Rooney said it himself. He doesn't like the word rebuild. There's no rebuilding in Pittsburgh. It's just not going to be a thing. And, I think to everyone that's been around the team and kind of knows where they're at, the Steelers feel like and I said this yesterday on that short mini pod I did, it really does feel like spin the wheels in motion. They're just doing the same thing they've been doing. I don't think McCarthy is necessarily going to have the bottom fall out from under him. I truly don't. I look at this and I say this is going to largely be a team that wins, more than 7 games probably most years, probably doesn't get very far in the playoffs. But I think you brought him on in the way we talked about it was you have to bring him on as a quarterback developer. And that's what people around the league do buy into McCarthy as. They buy into him as someone that can rehab quarterbacks, bring them along. So a young quarterback needs to come into this building, not just Will Howard. They need 1 or 2 guys, in my opinion, there to kind of bring along. So that's the lens I think they're looking this through. But the process was real rushed, didn't it? Feel like that, John?
It did.
It really only took 1 week. They started their interviews last Friday. They made the hire a week later. They've only brought in 3 guys in person. They didn't wait for the Rams guys. It did feel like a rush process. I thought it was a poor process in that regard. We will see where McCarthy goes. But this, to me, it's the type of hire you feel I don't think is like the worst case scenario, because I think there were worse hires. But it does feel kind of grimy and disgusting in some ways, because I think it is so bland on so many levels.
Yeah, I mean, really, if you look at the way they did it, they just did enough to check the boxes on the Rooney Rule. When they brought in Weaver and Flores, they clearly had their sights on McCarthy all the way. All of the buzz was around the LA Rams coaches, Shula and Shieldhouse. They don't even get an in-person interview. Maybe they thought they couldn't get him in here with the snowstorm. Who knows? But yeah, it does feel rushed. But it does intrigue me in terms of this development of the quarterback. But my question is, which quarterback? There's a report out there that McCarthy is intrigued by Will Howard's upside. But there's also this idea of this 2026 draft where the Steelers do have some ammunition, but it's not seeming like it's a good quarterback draft. It seems like 2027 will be the better quarterback draft. So, and it sounds like in consultation with his good friend Omar Khan, it's going to be McCarthy identifying who this quarterback is that the Steelers have their long-term interest in, and then develop that quarterback. So my question is, is this somebody that they bring in a younger guy in free agency, a Mac Jones, a Malik Willis this year? Is it somebody they look for in the draft? Is it Will Howard? Or is it somebody in 2027 that you bring in and then hope to really compete in 2028, a la what the Patriots have done, with Drake May, a second-year guy, ascended, one step away from the Super Bowl. So there's so many ways it could go. I'm just wondering how you think it looks in terms of what this quarterback development, finding it and identifying it and developing it.
Well, I think they should be one of the teams to make a run at Malik Willis. We've talked about that before. If Rodgers isn't coming back, obviously, if Rodgers wants to come back, I think he's the quarterback next year. That there's that obvious connection with Mike McCarthy. I know that things didn't end well in Green Bay, but Rodgers has talked multiple times about how he has grown much fonder of his time with Mike McCarthy over the years. The heart grows fonder when, it's always greener pastures there. And I think Mike McCarthy has at least shown Aaron Rodgers that, because Rodgers has so much freedom at the line of scrimmage in McCarthy's scheme. That's something that McCarthy really gives his quarterbacks. And there's a lot of pre-snap stuff in this scheme. It's an old school West Coast offense. It's not, the new age McVay Shanahan stuff. But old school West Coast always works. Every offense has an old school West Coast feel to it. And I think really where McCarthy's offense strength is in their under center play action stuff. That's fits the Steelers' identity to a degree, but they really need some wide receivers. In terms of quarterback, Malik Willis is if Rodgers, of course, doesn't want to come back. I think Malik Willis makes some sense. As a developmental guy, could he turn into the next franchise quarterback? That's the real question. I think he's an interesting proposition there. And this young quarterback class, it's just not very good. I mean, I don't really want to take Ty Simpson in the first round. I'm not a Ty Simpson guy. We'll talk about him more in depth, but there's a lot of things post-snap with his eyes, his pocket management, the accuracy when he's trying to push the ball. It's all a little bit spotty. Trinidad Chambliss, if he had come out, I think would have been somebody I would have been interested in the mid-rounds. But it looks like he's going to win that injunction and go back to Ole Miss. The one connection you immediately saw, to me, that makes sense, and Derek Bell tweeted this one out yesterday, McCarthy is really close friends with New Orleans Saints offensive coordinator Doug Nussmeier, who is the father of LSU quarterback Garrett Nussmeier. I think that one in the mid-rounds is one to watch. Nussmeier is a guy that was thought to be, a potential first-round pick this year, had a really poor year. Could McCarthy try and develop him? But I do think Will Howard's going to be one of the guys that he's going to try and develop. I think he's going to try and pour into. We saw there was a report by Tom Pelissero yesterday that said McCarthy is very intrigued by Will Howard's upside. So I do think he's going to try and develop Will Howard. I do think if they go for the top pick, it will be next year, not this year. I think it has to be. Now, is next year necessarily going to be guaranteed to be stronger? No. It looks like it'll be stronger right now, but we also said that last year. So we'll see. But it certainly seems like next year would be the time to take that top swing on a quarterback. And so my guess is if you're going to take a swing now, it's the mid-round guys or Malik Willis type. And then along, of course, with Will Howard. So we'll see. But obviously, I think quarterback this year, it really all hinges on what Aaron Rodgers wants to do. If he wants to come back, I have a hard time not seeing him be the quarterback. And if that happens, my guess is maybe you take a late-round quarterback this year, but you probably might just roll with the same one you had last year and make Will Howard the guy that you focus on and develop. And then in 2027, you recalibrate and move your ducks in a row, see where you're at.
I actually like the idea of getting Will Howard a deep look and the development potential there. I love that idea. I don't necessarily love engaging with who I have nothing bad to say about Aaron Rodgers, but I don't know if I want to go through that dance again where we don't find out until June that that he's coming on board. You know what I mean? So that has me a little dubious there. The other thing I'm hearing, on social media, or there's sort of like this Yinzer wish list. Okay, we're hiring McCarthy. Does this mean we're going to bring in Schillhouse as the offensive coordinator and coach in waiting? I just don't see that. And is there any chance, because they didn't do those in-person interviews with Shula and Schillhouse, waiting for that championship game to be played today, is there a chance that they got signals from both of them that they weren't interested in the Steelers job? Is there any chance of that?
I think anyone that is doing that is satisfied with the McCarthy hire and is trying to cope. I don't think that happened. I think Shula and Schillhouse were interested in the job and would have taken it if offered. Steelers job was one of the most coveted jobs in the cycle. A lot of people wanted this job. To my knowledge, no one pulled out of the job unless they knew they were getting another one. Like Jeff Hafley knew he was getting the Dolphins job and had a lot of connections there, with John Eric Sullivan being one of the Packers front office members and now going to Miami. So, yeah, I think that they would have taken the job. And to me, they should have waited, at least seen what those guys had to offer in terms of the in-person interview, giving them a shot. Because, again, this is kind of like the process in 2006. If the Steelers didn't bring Mike Tomlin, he's never the head coach. It would have been Ross Grimm. And I don't know if that would have been a good hire. We would have had to see. But, Mike Tomlin only blew him away because he came in for an interview and changed their minds. And I think at least having 5 candidates in person would have made it a stronger process, a healthier process. So, no, I think the Rams guys were interested in this job. I think that, there were concerns with both of them, right? Schulhouse has never called plays. Shula, I think there are concerns there. They're not like what type of staff would he build? I think he has access to a large battery that he could build from the McVay tree, but it's not like he was without concern. But also, I thought this was the time the Steelers could go for the riskier hire. This was kind of the time I think where they could try to bring in an innovative mind, hit the reset button. McCarthy isn't that. McCarthy feels very safe. I think he's going to keep a high floor for your franchise. The bottom will never fall out. You'll probably always be somewhat relevant around the playoff picture. And that's kind of where I view McCarthy. So the lens to hire McCarthy has to be through this quarterback development lens. That's the one way, you look at that. So he needs to hire a strong staff. His staffs in Dallas were not bad. They were, he had guys like Dan Quinn,
right,
Brian Schottenheimer, Kellen Moore, Mike Zimmer. He had some good staffs, and then he had some young staffers that are now really hotshot candidates. I think of guys like Al Harris. I think of guys like Scott Tolzien. Like there's a few there, and then there's other ones that have been around, veteran coaches that have been around for a long time. But like there were some interesting staffs there in Dallas, so we'll see what type of staff he builds. I think that's one thing to watch if he can build a robust staff, that'll be one thing to think about.
Yeah, I'm intrigued, because especially by the offensive coordinator position, because clearly the Steelers, after going on the defensive side for their last three head coaches that date back to 1969, are clearly accentuating the offense here in a quarterback-driven league, and I think that probably is the right move, and certainly making a concerted effort to develop your next franchise quarterback after stumbling and bumbling it for so many years. Even before Ben retired, leading up to his retirement, there was some stumbling and bumbling. They did not seemingly have a plan, and they reached for Kenny Pickett, and then they, signed some veterans, and maybe Rodgers is coming back. But for offensive coordinator, we know McCarthy has said that he will not give up play calling duties. I guess he did it once, didn't like it, and likes to call plays. So given that he, rather than the coordinator, would call plays, do you buy into this idea like of a hot, sexy guy like Shieldhouse would take that job? Or do you think that hamstrings us in bringing in an up-and-comer who could possibly then ascend to the head coaching position from the offensive coordinator position?
I don't think it hamstrings them. I mean, he had Kellen Moore before Kellen Moore was the hot shot candidate he is now, and obviously he's a head coach now. He had Kellen Moore on his staff for the first 3 years of his tenure in Dallas. And to me, it doesn't hamstring the Steelers necessarily. Now, listen, that hot shot candidate's not going to call plays. I don't think they're going to pull Shieldhouse out of L.A. because Mike LaFleur right now is also the favorite there, the Rams OC, to get the Cardinals job. I'm assuming Shieldhouse will get that job if he is hired. I do think it allows the Steelers to hire someone, though, like Scott Tolzien, who's the quarterback's coach for the Saints. McCarthy is the type of coach where it is the perfect type of situation to hire that young OC, right? It's where you can mentor someone like that. And that's kind of the type of brand McCarthy has done. He's always trying to get new young assistants into his staff. At least he was in Dallas. And you look at some of them, and he has not, and you look at his career, he has not shied away from hiring first-time offensive coordinators. So there are certainly a lot of veteran options they could hire. They could hire like Alex Van Pelt, Luke Getsy. I think Van Pelt, obviously, both those guys are Pittsburgh guys. Van Pelt would be, in my opinion, actually, I like Alex Van Pelt. I don't hate that hire at all. Again, another quarterback kind of developer there. I think they're going to have a senior offensive assistant on this staff, though, so you kind of got a battery for that, who it's going to be. I think it's going to be a bigger staff than it was under Tomlin. I think that's fair to say. McCarthy staffs are generally bigger. They have more assistants. They have more, senior offensive assistants, things like that. But yeah, they can bring in a young guy there. Defensive coordinator is going to be the real hire to watch here. Who's it going to be? And I think there's a few interesting names. I think Patrick Graham from the Raiders defensive coordinator is a really interesting name that you can look at. I know it's the Raiders, and people are going to be like, stay away from that Raiders. Patrick Graham is, I think, a star in the making in this business. Would be a great hire. If I were them, I think he's probably going to go to New York with John Harbaugh, but, man, I'd make a run at Anthony Weaver. I mean, you brought him in. If you can get him on the staff, make him the defensive coordinator, I think that's something you could look at. I'd try to make a run at Raheem Morris because in terms of McCarthy, he has shown the ability to go outside of his immediate circle and hire guys. There are some like distant connections he had with Moore and Quinn, but nothing straight on the book. He never coached under them. He never coached with them. So he's been able to go deeper into his Rolodex at times. So you put everyone on the table. And then Al Harris, the Bears pass game coordinator and DB's coach to me. Very interesting. He's a first-time defensive coordinator. That is, generally speaking, McCarthy did hire veteran DCs. He hired Mike Nolan, he hired Dan Quinn, and Mike Zimmer. All those guys were vets. So I'm kind of throwing out veteran DCs, but Al Harris is the first-time candidate. I think that makes sense. And then you have Joe Witt Jr., who was just fired by the Commanders. Not a very inspiring option to me. Could be someone that I think you could bring on, though, as a secondary coach, and feel pretty confident about that. He has a track record of developing defensive backs. So there's a few interesting names there for DC, and we'll see where things go. Obviously, those interviews will start when McCarthy gets in the building and really starts to settle it in. I'm sure he can't get here just yet because of the snow. But we'll see when that happens. They'll probably start this week where he starts interviewing candidates on the boots, and we'll see where things go from there. But there is an interesting battery I think he has in terms of defensive coordinator picks that he could choose from.
No, I think that sounds interesting, and I just can't wait to see this staff. But the other thing that one of the chat guys just reminded me that Art Rooney II is just being brutalized for this, and he actually came up with a new nickname for Art that's based on a bodily emission. So you can use your imagination and check the chat for that. But worse than a safe pick, they're calling this a scared pick, a pick that Dan Rooney, the late great Dan Rooney, would not have made, and that's probably accurate. But it is a pick that old Art Rooney, the chief, the founder of the Steelers, would have made. I mean, he tapped a lot of veteran guys over his 4 decades in the wilderness trying to land a playoff win for the Steelers, and then that only happened after Dan got involved and helped pick Chuck Noll. So Art Rooney would have made this pick. And the other issue here is Omar Khan, that he's being very closely tied to this pick. And then we get reports that Andy Weidel is being interviewed for GM positions. So a lot of people are concerned about the brain trust of the Steelers between Art and Khan being in the power positions. Clearly, Khan had a relationship with McCarthy. They love the idea that he's a Pittsburgh guy, that this is McCarthy's dream job and has been since day one. So what do you make of what this says about the front office of the Steelers and the dynamics behind the scenes? Were they scared, or do they think that they have a strategy here?
I mean, it's a short-term strategy. I don't think it's like some long-term, I don't think McCarthy's going to be here 15 years, right? I think that they wanted to hire somebody that they felt could continue to win. And I think that's really the underlying current to all of this is Art Rooney is never going to be someone that just goes and says, you know what, we need to blow this up. It's just not going to happen. And this was Art's hire mainly. I think Khan did have a bigger say in it. Danny Rooney, who is the successor to Art, did sit in on these interviews to at least gain knowledge of it all, right? It's kind of like how Art did with Cowher in that way, where he sat in on it. And you do mention it, Dan Rooney, instrumental in Noel, Cowher, and Tomlin hiring. So this is truly Art's first one that's him. And I don't think Dan would have made that hire. I think he probably would have hired one of the younger guys. But it's also, I think Art comes from a different mindset. He just wants to win. He wants to win now. And, I think to him, 10-7, making the playoffs is fine in that regard. He's shown an ability that he's okay with that. And I think you're going to see a lot of things that are similar to that. I think they're going to go 9-8, 10-7. So we're going to the wild card round, probably lose. I think that it's kind of just, again, I said running your tires in mud. I still believe that. Until you get a young quarterback in here, it's just going to feel like a lot of the same, I think. And so that's really going to be something to think about. But yeah, I think Art was instrumental in this hire, obviously. I think he was the guy. Omar, I think, had a say in this hire. But the brain trust is different than what it was back in 2007 when they hired Mike Tomlin. It just isn't the same. The thought process is a little different in what they're looking for. They didn't look for the next coach necessarily that was going to be here for 15 years. They went for the short-term option. And then they went for someone that they thought has kind of a battery and an ability to develop a quarterback. And I think those are the two things that got Mike McCarthy hired. Mike McCarthy showed teams that he interviewed with, I think he only interviewed with 2, that he has a history of developing quarterbacks. That was a lot of his selling point. Aaron Rodgers developed under him and became the MVP candidate while he sat behind Brett Favre. Brett Favre had his late career resurgence with McCarthy at the start. Dak Prescott went from good quarterback to top-level MVP candidate quarterback. There's a development track record there. That's the way you talk yourself into this hire. If you don't like it, if you like it, this is what you use. That quarterback, the quarterback development that Mike McCarthy has done is 100% true, and you look at it. And so that to me is the way this works. But right now, I do think it was a short-term hire in that regard. And then the Steelers are going to hope that Mike McCarthy, when they get a quarterback, can help develop and bring that guy along.
Absolutely. And really just biologically, the actuarial tables of a 62-year-old guy, I mean, it is definitely going to be a shorter tenure for Mike McCarthy just based on that. And he does have a 5-year contract. And that's what intrigues me about this idea of having some heir apparent on the staff too. So that'll be interesting to watch. But the sort of, and you mentioned it just there. McCarthy was such a low key candidate in this coaching. 10 vacancies out there, and he was way down the list. He only interviewed, I think, with the Steelers and the Titans. But if you look at it, you have John Harbaugh getting hired by the Giants, and it's universally held as a great hire. He's older than McCarthy. You look at their tenures in the NFL; they line up almost identically. You have two retread coaches coaching in the AFC Championship game at 3 p.m., and you have Andy Reid, who was a retread. So I just don't know why there is so much whining about the idea that we're hiring a retread and not the young up and coming guy. It seems like that can be viable. How do you feel about that?
I mean, here's the thing. I think McCarthy, one thing I will say I don't understand is why John Harbaugh's hire is being praised as some game-changing, culture-shattering move in New York. Well, everyone thinks McCarthy stinks. Mm-hmm. I don't think McCarthy's a bad coach. And I think that's one thing I want to make fairly clear. I do think he's an uninspiring hire, just because I don't think it changes the spots of this organization much. But I also, John Harbaugh is not appreciably a better coach. You look at Mike McCarthy's resume, it's very similar to Harbaugh, to Tomlin, to even Sean Payton. It is very similar to these guys. And so that is one thing that I think is a little weird. Why that is being a pushed thing. And so I do think McCarthy, is going to come in here and the offense is going to change. It's going to be a little similar to how Bruce Arians ran it back in the day, but it's not quite the same because, McCarthy's true and blue roots really are old school West Coast. And it's going to look like, passing football, from the late 2000s, early 2010s. And there's obviously been tweaks to it, and there will be tweaks to it to fit personnel. But even the Cowboys this year ran a very similar scheme. Schottenheimer's basically running McCarthy's scheme in Dallas. You can absolutely produce top offenses with this offense. You just need the personnel to do it. So the Steelers, the big thing the Steelers need is wide receivers. They need two of them at least, because they're going to play way more 11 personnel than they usually did last year under Arthur Smith. So that's going to have to be a retooling aspect. I think, Gainwell coming back is even more important now. He fits very well as a receiving back in this offense. There's some things here personnel-wise that they're going to have to adjust. But, yeah, that is one thing about the McCarthy hire that I do think is weird. I don't really understand the disconnect there between the Harbaugh and the McCarthy resumes. They're identically the same. And in a lot of ways, there's a lot of similarities between them. They both haven't gotten over the hump very recently in the playoffs. McCarthy went 12-5, 12-5, and 12-5, and 3 straight years in Dallas, and largely got let go in large part because of a lack of postseason success. That's also why John Harbaugh got let go with Lamar Jackson. They obviously just kind of fit into the same mold there, but I do think the difference in PR is kind of interesting there. I don't really know how to explain it. It doesn't make much sense to me.
No, I agree. That stood out to me too when I just saw the reaction. And one of the guys in the chat did point out that the reason for most of the whining was the fact that, well, just as you said, nobody was really waiting on McCarthy. So why rush the pick? Is there any reason in terms of just preparation for free agency in the draft why they decided, okay, if McCarthy's our guy, why wait to interview anyone else? We'll just take him now and get him down to work in terms of working with Khan and hopefully Weidel as well, in shaping this 2026 roster, but also the longer range plan for the franchise quarterback development? Do you think they just decided?
I don't think that. Yeah, I don't think that rushed the hire or anything. I think that they just had their guy in Mike McCarthy, and they made the hire when they knew it.
Okay.
And listen, I think the league must have known this happened. Do you remember Mike McCarthy's interview in person was Wednesday? Brian Flores signed that extension in Minnesota the same night. Clearly, this was a vibe that had kind of gotten around the league, that people thought that this was going to go towards Mike McCarthy's way. I think that must have become fairly clear to people and around the league. And that's why Brian Flores went back to Minnesota in that regard. I'm thinking that, that's why we just saw that activity there. That's why you saw the Rodgers back to Pittsburgh murmurings midweek. It was kind of odd and off the wall. But then you kind of put the pieces together and you're like, okay, that makes some sense there. It is kind of this cycle of coaching candidates, and it was kind of interesting that the cycle of coaching candidates was one of the weaker ones I can remember. And I guess, to that effect, it kind of made environmental conditions perfect for a McCarthy hire. You were the Steelers. I think that there were good defensive minds. I like Jesse Minter. I like Chris Shula. Shieldhouse is a really big swing. There's a lot of issues, hiring a guy that hasn't called plays at the NFL level before. I do like Shieldhouse's background, but that is a big leap. We haven't seen the pass game coordinator to head coach jump yet. Who knows how that's going to look? We might find out in Cleveland. Shieldhouse is a very big candidate there with the Browns. But to me, there are some conditions there that made the McCarthy hire possible. I still think, I probably would have gone in the Shula Minter direction. Again, they're riskier hires than McCarthy. But I do think that this organization kind of needs a little turnover, someone that shakes the boat a little bit, rocks it. I don't think McCarthy's going to necessarily do that. But I do there are conditions that were around the league, I think, that allowed McCarthy to get hired here by Pittsburgh. And I do think, that they are going to now have to shift at least offensive strategy. Who knows what they're going to run defensively? McCarthy has run a lot of different schemes with his guys over the years. They've run, the Legion of Boom, cover 3 types of defenses. They've run 2 high. He's really going to have to evaluate his roster and look at what he wants to run. Like if they hired Al Harris, for example, he's big into man coverage, press man. It would fit Joey Porter Jr. like a glove. You're going to have to look at the personnel and really decide who is going to be the perfect hire there defensively. I think that's going to be the interesting thing. But now you know what you're hiring, what you're looking for offensively, and they need some really dynamic playmaking wide receivers in this draft class. I think there's no doubt about that. They have 12 picks. And I wonder now if you make a mini jump up the board to go get one of the top receivers, a guy like Jordan Tyson, a guy like Mekhi Lemon, Carnell Tate, someone in that vein. Do you maybe try and go get him? Because the first year Mike McCarthy was in Dallas, they picked CD Lamb, and he became the cornerstone piece of their offense. The Steelers need DK Metcalf plus somebody else in this offense for it to really reach its maximum potential. So that wide receiver position that we had talked about, it was important. Now it is essential. They have to get somebody that's a difference maker at the wide receiver spot.
Oh, absolutely. I think this draft, like you said, is going to be wide receiver, cornerback, maybe some other pieces on defense that, and if they take a quarterback, it's going to be mid-round. And I also totally agree that there was definitely an undertone vibe change throughout that week of in-person interviews in Pittsburgh, where the agents for some of these coaches must have been talking amongst each other saying, hey, McCarthy's got this gig lined up, and then Flores takes the re-ups, and the dominoes fell in place. And I do agree with you that it wasn't rushed as so much that the Steelers were sold by whatever PowerPoint presentation that McCarthy made in his interview, talking about all these quarterbacks that he's developed, and that's what the Steelers need. We need to find and develop a franchise quarterback. That is the bottom line. That has been the biggest deficiency in Pittsburgh. Now, the one question I have, and I've seen this circulating, that because we don't have the young offensive mastermind, and because we don't have the defensive guy with aura as our head coach, does it handicap us in bringing in free agents in this next cycle, because we know one thing about Tomlin, he could attract players. Now, whether they were picking the right players to come in free agency, that's another thing. But he had that attraction for players that they wanted to play for him. Does Mike McCarthy, absent some sexy picks on his staff, at defensive coordinator and offensive coordinator, does he have that same kind of ability to lure in guys who want to come and play for him?
Well, listen, Mike Tomlin had a very special ability to do that. I think he had the ultimate kind of reputation as a player's coach, as someone that people really wanted to come play for. I don't think McCarthy's going to have that, but also I'm not sure there's many coaches that players just go into free agency saying, man, I want to play for that guy. That's very rare. And Mike Tomlin, that is one of his superpowers, was his relationships with players. And so, yeah, I think there will be a step back in terms of that, but you pay somebody, they'll come. You know what I mean? Now, are you going to see somebody like take a low ball offer maybe to come play for Pittsburgh? I don't think so. But they'll still have they'll be able to get free agents. You know what I mean? It's not going to be like, they have healthy cap space. They are going to be able to pay guys, and they're not going to have to overpay necessarily to get them. So they're going to have a healthy cap space situation where they can go out and sign difference makers at spots they want to. So that there will be an ability for the Steelers to go out and make some hires that also really rock that boat in that regard. If you make a staff that looks good on paper, people want to play for that staff, even if it's unproven. If you hire a guy like Al Harris, he's thought of very highly in football circles. You hire a guy like Patrick Graham, again, highly thought of in football circles. Those guys still attract those players because agents talk to these guys. Agents will direct them in those directions as well. So I don't think they'll have the Mike Tomlin pool, because I think that was unique to Mike Tomlin in a lot of ways, even in the modern NFL. But I do think the Steelers will still be able to land free agents, and it shouldn't be too much of an issue because they will pay, and they will pay a fair market price, as they have to some of these guys over the years.
Absolutely, Nick. So we're basically just getting started. The Mike McCarthy era is 24 hours old. We from the initial reports, we didn't even have a news conference with him yet. So there'll be Nick and all his colleagues in Pittsburgh will be firing off questions to Mike, the head coach. And, you have now the gearing up, the Senior Bowl and all that process leading up to the draft. So lots going on. We haven't really sorted out our schedule for the Steelers breakdown, but it's very possible as this week proceeds ahead, we'll have more episodes and get into certainly the press conference on all that thing and dissecting what McCarthy has to say as he addresses Steelers Nation, his hometown, born and bred in Greenfield, and a Steelers fan all his life, now addresses his nation as our new leader. So we will stay tuned for that and have special coverage throughout here on the Steelers Breakdown. Until then, enjoy the championship games today and hope the Steelers can participate in such meaningful games in the near future. Until